The first thing I noticed was the handwriting, not the note itself, not the message, the handwriting, because I had seen it before. It was the same handwriting my landlord used on every maintenance notice in my apartment building, except this note wasn't from my landlord. And whoever had written it had taped it to the inside of my front door. It said only 4 words, "Don't look outside tonight." I stood there staring at it for probably 30 seconds. Then I laughed, not because it was funny. Mostly because I didn't know what else to do. At the time, I thought someone was messing with me. I had no idea that 4 hours later, I would be sitting on the floor of my bedroom with every light turned off, watching a man's shadow move across my curtains. And I had absolutely no idea that the person who left that note had probably saved my life. My name is Daniel. At the time this happened, I was 29 years old and living alone in a small apartment complex on the edge of town. It wasn't a bad place. It wasn't particularly nice either. The building was old, the walls were thin, and most of the tenants kept to themselves. There were 12 apartments in my building, 6 downstairs, 6 upstairs. I lived in 2B. My apartment faced the parking lot, and directly across from my bedroom window was a narrow strip of grass, a sidewalk, and a row of large bushes that separated our property from an older residential street. Normally, there wasn't anything interesting outside. Cars came and went. People walked their dogs. Sometimes kids rode bicycles along the sidewalk. That was about it. I had lived there for almost 2 years. I knew most of the regular noises. The upstairs neighbor walking around, the washing machine in the laundry room, the pipes knocking inside the walls, the front door slamming downstairs. You get used to those things when you live somewhere long enough. That's why the note bothered me. It was too deliberate. Someone had to walk into the building, walk up the stairs, come down my hallway, and tape something directly to my door. There were no security cameras inside the building. The only camera was outside near the parking lot. I pulled the note off the door and looked down the hallway. Nothing. I walked to the stairwell, still nothing. I even looked through the window at the end of the hallway. There was nobody outside. I went back into my apartment and put the note on my kitchen counter. For a few minutes, I tried to figure out who could have written it. My first thought was my landlord. Maybe there had been some kind of emergency. Maybe someone had seen something outside, but if that were the case, why wouldn't he simply call me? I called him, he didn't answer. I sent him a message, no response. I figured I'd ask him about it the next morning. Then I noticed something that made the situation a little stranger. The paper wasn't printer paper. It was the same pale yellow paper my landlord used for handwritten notices, and the handwriting really did look like his. The letters were slightly crooked. The capital D had a long straight line. The lowercase t's were unusually tall. Even the way the writer crossed their t's looked the same. I kept staring at it. Then I told myself I was being ridiculous. Someone could easily have copied his handwriting. It wasn't exactly difficult. I threw the note into a drawer and went back to my evening. Around 9:30 I ordered dinner. Around 10:15 I took a shower. At about 10:40 I was sitting on my couch watching television when I heard something outside. 3 knocks, not on my door, on the window. I froze. The sound came from the living room. 3 soft taps. I looked toward the window. Nothing. I waited. Another 3 taps. This time I knew it wasn't the television. I turned the volume down. The apartment became completely silent. I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. I could hear the air conditioner running. And then I heard footsteps outside, slow footsteps. Someone was walking along the sidewalk in front of my apartment. I stood up. My first instinct was to look through the window. Then I remembered the note, "Don't look outside tonight." I actually smiled to myself. I thought, okay, this is getting stupid. Maybe someone was playing a prank. Maybe one of the neighbors had left the note because they knew someone was outside. I walked toward the window. I got within a few feet of it, then I stopped. I don't know why, something about that note suddenly didn't feel funny anymore. I stepped away from the window. The footsteps continued, slow, measured. They stopped directly outside my apartment. I waited, nothing happened. Then my phone vibrated. I nearly dropped it. I looked at the screen, unknown number. One message, I told you not to look. My stomach dropped. I immediately checked the window. The curtains were closed. I hadn't looked outside, so how did they know I had walked toward it? I typed back, "Who is this?" The message showed as delivered. No response. I sent another. "How do you know where I live?" Nothing. I walked to the front door and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I could see the stairwell. Nobody. I unlocked the deadbolt but didn't open the door. Then I heard something from the other side, a faint scrape. Like someone dragging the sole of their shoe across the floor. I stepped backward. My phone vibrated again. Another message, "Don't open the door." I stared at it. For the first time that night, I felt genuinely afraid. I turned off the television. Then I turned off every light except the small lamp in my bedroom. I didn't know what was happening, but someone clearly knew where I was, and they knew I had received the note. I called the police. While I waited, I told the dispatcher everything. The note, the footsteps, the messages, the person outside. She asked me if I could see anyone. I told her no. She asked if I was sure someone was actually outside. I said I couldn't prove it. She told me officers would check the area. About 8 minutes later, I heard a car pull into the parking lot. Blue lights flashed through the curtains. 2 officers walked around the building. They checked the hallway, they checked the parking lot, they checked the sidewalk. Nobody was there. One of the officers knocked on my door. I opened it. He asked me about the messages. I showed him my phone. He looked at them and then asked something strange. "Did you receive the first message before or after you heard the footsteps?" I told him before. He looked at the other officer. Then he asked me where I found the note. I pointed toward the kitchen. He walked over and picked it up. He studied it for several seconds. Then he asked me something that made the room feel colder. "Does your landlord normally write these himself?" I said yes. He turned the paper over. There was something written on the back. I hadn't noticed it. Neither had the officers at first. It was a small sentence, written in the same handwriting. "He can see you from the other side." The officer read it twice. Then he asked me where my bedroom was. I pointed toward the hallway. He walked over. He didn't enter. He simply stood there looking at the bedroom window. Then he asked me something else. "Is that window normally locked?" I told him yes. He asked me to check. I walked into the bedroom. The curtains were still closed. I reached for the window. The lock was open. I knew I had locked it before going to sleep the night before. I always locked it. The officer immediately told me not to touch anything else. He stepped into the room. He looked at the window. Then he looked outside through the gap in the curtains. His expression changed. I asked him what he saw. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked his partner to come into the room. The 2 officers stood beside the window. They whispered to each other. Then one of them walked outside. The other stayed with me. A few minutes later, the officer outside called him. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could tell from his face that something had changed. He hung up. Then he looked at me. "Do you have a basement?" I said no. "Storage room?" "No." "Any access to the space behind your bedroom wall?" I stared at him. "No." He nodded. Then he said something that made absolutely no sense. "Someone has been standing outside your bedroom window." I asked how he knew. He pointed toward the grass below the window. There were footprints, fresh ones, a lot of them. Someone had been standing beneath my bedroom window for a long time, and then the officer pointed toward the bushes. There was a narrow path through them. A path I had never noticed before. It led from the sidewalk directly toward my bedroom window, but that wasn't the worst part. The footprints didn't lead away from the window, they stopped there, as if whoever had been standing outside had simply disappeared. The officer looked at me. "Do you know anyone who might be watching you?" I said no. He asked if I'd recently argued with anyone. No. An ex? No. A co-worker? No. Anyone online? I told him no. He wrote something down. Then he asked me to stay somewhere else for the night. I agreed. While I packed a bag, my phone vibrated again. Another message. I looked at the screen. This time there were only 3 words. "He's still there." I looked toward the bedroom. The officer was standing near the window. I wanted to tell him. But before I could say anything, he turned around, and his face told me he had received the exact same message. I didn't leave the control room. I couldn't. I sat there staring at the monitor, watching myself walk through the East Gallery, except I wasn't in the East Gallery. I was sitting in front of the cameras, and the version of me on the screen was walking in the opposite direction. I checked the time on the recording, 2:17 a.m. Then I looked at the clock above the control room door, 2:17 a.m. I watched the footage again. There I was, walking slowly past the glass display cases, stopping, looking toward the camera, then continuing down the hallway. I paused the recording. My face was visible for only a second, but it was enough. It was me, same uniform, same flashlight, same ID badge, even the same small cut on my left hand. I looked down at my hand. The cut was still there. Then something happened that made me stop breathing. The figure on the monitor turned its head, not toward the camera, toward something behind it. I couldn't see what, then it walked out of frame. I rewound the footage. Again and again, nothing, no one followed me, at least not on that camera. I pulled up the camera from the hallway, the one directly outside the control room. The hallway was empty. I switched to the East Gallery. Empty. North Corridor, empty. Storage area, empty. Then I switched back to the East Gallery. The armor was there, standing beside the display case. Except the armor wasn't supposed to be there. It had originally been displayed in the medieval history room, a room on the opposite side of the building. I checked the floor plan. The two galleries weren't even connected. There was a solid wall between them. I grabbed the printed floor plan from the desk. The building had been renovated several times over the years, but the original layout was still included in the archive records. I started comparing the old plan with what I had seen that night, and that's when I noticed something. There was a corridor missing from the current building, not closed off, not demolished, missing. According to the original blueprint, a narrow hallway ran behind the East Gallery. It connected to an old staircase leading underground. I searched through the museum's maintenance records. The staircase had supposedly been sealed in 1979. I found the document. The reason was listed as structural damage. But underneath the official explanation, someone had written something by hand, 3 words, "Do not reopen." I stared at those words for a long time. Then I heard something outside the control room, a soft metallic sound like metal touching metal. I turned toward the door, nothing. Then another sound, closer. I reached for my flashlight. The hallway outside was dark. I opened the door, nothing was there. But on the floor was something I hadn't seen before, a small brass key. I picked it up. There was a number engraved on it, 17. I immediately knew what it belonged to. The old underground staircase had a door marked 17. I'd seen it in the archived photographs. I didn't know why I did it. Maybe curiosity. Maybe because I was already too far into this, but I walked toward the East Gallery. The museum felt completely different now. The corridors seemed longer, the ceiling lights were farther apart, and every few steps I had the strange feeling that someone was walking behind me. I stopped. Nothing. I continued. When I reached the gallery, the armor was gone. The glass display case was empty. I walked closer. There was no sign that anyone had opened it. Then I noticed something scratched into the wooden floor beneath the case, a series of numbers over and over. I followed the markings. They led toward the far wall. I pressed my hand against it. Nothing. Then I noticed a thin line running vertically through the wooden paneling, a door. It had been painted over so many times that it almost disappeared into the wall. I took out the brass key. There was a small keyhole hidden beneath the paint. I inserted the key. It turned immediately. The door opened inward. Behind it was a narrow staircase. The air coming from below was cold, and it smelled old, not mold, not decay, something closer to dust and machine oil. I descended. There were 12 steps, then the staircase turned. Another 12, then another. The deeper I went, the quieter the museum became. Eventually, I reached a concrete corridor. There were old electrical cables running along the ceiling. Most were disconnected. At the end of the corridor was a metal door. Someone had painted over the number, but I could still make it out. 17. I opened it. Inside was a room filled with old equipment, broken monitors, film reels, boxes, old museum labels, and an entire wall covered with photographs. I walked closer. Every photograph showed the museum, different years, different renovations, different exhibits, but there was something strange about all of them. The same man appeared in the background. Sometimes he was a visitor, sometimes a maintenance worker, sometimes he was barely visible behind an exhibit, but he was always there. And he always wore the same dark suit of armor. I felt sick. Then I found a photograph dated 1978. It showed the museum's original security room. There were 3 guards sitting behind a desk, and behind them was the armor, standing in the corner, the exact same armor. It looked brand new. I turned the photograph over. There was a handwritten note. Camera 4 recorded him again. I looked at the wall. There was a camera mounted in the corner of the room. It was old, but the red indicator light was on. I stepped backward. Then the monitor beside it flickered. The screen came alive, static. Then an image appeared. It was the museum, but not the museum I knew. The walls were different, the exhibits were different, and the hallway looked older. Then I saw someone walking through the corridor. It was me, again. Except this time I wasn't wearing my security uniform. I was wearing ordinary clothes, the same clothes I had worn on my first day at the museum. The recording continued. I watched myself walk toward the camera, then stop, then slowly turn around. Behind me stood the suit of armor. I watched the figure place one hand on my shoulder. The screen went black. I stepped away from the monitor, and then I heard footsteps behind me, slow, heavy, metal against concrete. I turned around. The armor was standing at the end of the corridor. I couldn't see anyone inside it, but it was moving, one step at a time, toward me. I ran. I slammed the metal door shut and sprinted up the staircase. I didn't look back. When I reached the gallery, I ran straight toward the control room. But the hallway wasn't the same anymore. The doorway to the control room was gone. Instead, there was a long corridor extending farther than the building should have allowed. I stopped. I knew this corridor. It was the one from the old photographs. The one that had supposedly been removed decades ago. I turned around. The staircase was gone. There was only a wall behind me. I was trapped inside a part of the museum that shouldn't have existed. Then I heard a voice, not from behind me. From the security radio clipped to my belt. Static, then my own voice, "Don't turn around." I froze. My own voice continued, "Whatever you do, don't turn around." I didn't. For several seconds there was silence. Then the radio spoke again. This time it wasn't my voice. It was an older man's voice. "He's already behind you." I dropped the radio, and I ran. I don't remember how long I ran. I only remember seeing the emergency exit sign ahead. I pushed through the door, and suddenly I was back in the museum lobby. The lights were on, the front doors were visible. The security desk was exactly where it belonged. I ran outside. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I drove straight home. The next morning I called my supervisor. I told him everything. He didn't laugh. That was the part that scared me the most. He went completely silent. Then he asked me one question. "Did you go downstairs?" I said yes. He sighed. Then he told me something he had never told me before. The museum had discovered those underground rooms years ago. But they weren't part of the original building plans. Nobody knew who constructed them. And in 1979, after several employees reported seeing the armor moving between galleries, the museum sealed the entire section. The official record said the area had been destroyed during renovations. But my supervisor admitted that wasn't true. He had been told never to go looking for it. I asked him about the photographs. He wouldn't answer. Then I asked about the security footage. He finally said something that I still think about. "There's no camera 4." I told him I had seen it. He said there hadn't been a camera 4 since 1981. Then he asked me to come back to the museum. I refused. 2 days later, the police contacted me. Apparently, someone had broken into the museum overnight. Nothing was stolen, nothing was damaged. Except one thing, the old sealed section had been opened. The police found several items inside: food, water bottles, blankets, tools, fresh batteries, and dozens of hand-drawn maps of the museum. Someone had been living down there for how long, nobody knew. But there was one thing that bothered me more than everything else. They found a chair facing an old surveillance monitor. The monitor was still working, and on the screen was footage from the museum lobby. The timestamp was from the night I disappeared into the underground corridor. The camera showed me walking into the museum, then walking toward the East Gallery, then disappearing, but according to the footage, I never came back out. The police asked me where I had been after leaving the gallery. I told them I had gone outside. They showed me the footage again. There was no footage of me leaving. None. The last image of me was standing inside the museum, looking directly at the camera. Then the screen went black. The museum eventually closed the entire East Wing. I quit my job. I never went back. For months, I tried convincing myself that exhaustion had caused everything. Maybe I had fallen asleep. Maybe I had wandered into restricted areas without remembering. Maybe the footage had been corrupted. There had to be a logical explanation. Then, almost a year later, I received an envelope. There was no return address. Inside was a single photograph. It showed the museum lobby. The picture looked old, very old, but the timestamp written on the back was dated 1 week after I quit, and there I was, standing in the lobby, wearing my old security uniform. Looking directly at the camera, behind me stood the suit of armor, and beneath the photograph was a handwritten sentence: "You forgot something downstairs." I never found out who sent it. I never found out who had been living beneath the museum. And I still don't know what that armor actually was. But there is one thing I know: the museum didn't move its exhibits. Something was moving them, and whatever it was, had been watching that building for decades. Maybe it still is. Because according to the museum's current website, the East Wing is permanently closed. But every few months, a new photograph appears online. A photograph taken inside that closed section. And in every photograph, the same suit of armor is standing somewhere in the background, always facing the camera. Always in a different room, and always a little closer than it was in the photograph before. That was the end of this story. If you've ever experienced something you still can't explain or have a strange story of your own, send it to Tales of the Dark. Your story could become the next nightmare featured on this channel. If you are new here, subscribe to Tales of the Dark, where every story gives you a nightmare.